The moment I saw 4 HOA trucks parked outside my gate, I knew something was wrong. Not one truck. Not two. 4. They were lined up across the gravel road like they were preparing for construction. Workers were already stepping out, unloading tool bags, survey stakes, and a pair of bolt cutters. I walked down from my porch slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I saw her. Elaine Whitmore, president of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA. She stood beside the trucks with a clipboard in her hand, pointing directly at the chain across my gate. "This road belongs to the HOA," she announced to the workers. "Cut the lock. We're opening it today." One of the men lifted the bolt cutters. I spoke calmly. "You're standing on private property." He hesitated. Elaine didn't. "Do it." That's when I pulled out my phone and called the county land use inspector. Because if Elaine thought 4 trucks would intimidate me, she had no idea what was about to happen next. The gravel road Elaine was pointing at that morning wasn't some forgotten shortcut the HOA had suddenly discovered. It had been there long before Pine Ridge Estates ever existed. My grandfather built that road himself almost 40 years ago. Back then, this entire area was nothing but ranch land and scattered farmhouses. My grandfather bought the property when it was little more than open pasture and a small creek cutting through the back acreage. He ran cattle, repaired tractors in the old barn, and used that gravel road to move equipment between the fields and the county highway. Every stone on that road had a purpose. As a kid, I spent countless weekends helping him maintain it, patching washouts after storms, hauling fresh gravel, clearing branches after heavy winds. Later, when the ranch passed down to my father and eventually to me, that road became part of the daily routine of keeping the land running. It wasn't just a road, it was part of the property's history. Years later, Pine Ridge Estates started appearing just beyond the western fence line. What used to be open fields turned into rows of identical houses and quiet cul-de-sacs. When the first families moved in, a few of them assumed the gravel road behind my gate connected to their development. But once the original HOA board checked the county records, the situation became clear. The road sat entirely inside our property boundary. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, nothing that gave the HOA any claim to it. So the issue faded away. For several years, nobody mentioned it again. Then Elaine Whitmore became HOA president. She ran on a platform about improving infrastructure, expanding access roads, and giving the HOA more control over the surrounding area. At first, it seemed like typical HOA politics: committees, landscaping rules, parking restrictions. But a few months after she took over, I started receiving letters. At first, they were polite questions asking about the gate across the gravel road. Then the language started changing. The letters mentioned potential access conflicts and possible emergency route concerns. Soon, rumors started circulating among the residents. Apparently, some people were saying that the gravel road behind my gate had always been meant as an emergency access route for the neighborhood. And according to those rumors, the only thing standing in the way was me. The man with the bolt cutter stepped closer to my gate. The metal jaws of the tool opened slowly around the chain that held the gate shut. Morning sunlight caught the steel links, making them flash briefly as he adjusted his grip. "Hold on," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him pause. He looked over his shoulder toward Elaine Whitmore. She stood a few feet behind him with her arms folded, watching everything like she was overseeing a construction crew instead of standing at the entrance to someone else's property. I walked closer to the gate, stopping just a few feet away. "Before you cut anything," I said, "I'd like to see the legal authorization for that." The worker lowered the bolt cutter slightly. Elaine stepped forward. "The HOA doesn't need your permission," she said calmly. "Our attorneys have already reviewed this road." I looked at her. "Then show me the documents." She gave a short laugh. "This gravel road has always been designated as an emergency access route for Pine Ridge Estates," she continued, raising her voice just enough for the workers and now a few nearby residents to hear. "You've been blocking it for years." "That's not true," I replied. "This road sits entirely inside my property line." Elaine shook her head like she was correcting a stubborn child. "Our legal team disagrees." Behind her, another truck door slammed shut. 2 more workers stepped out, glancing toward the gate as if waiting for instructions. The man with the bolt cutters shifted his weight, clearly unsure whether to continue. That hesitation didn't last long. Go ahead, Elaine told him. He raised the cutters again. By then, a few curious neighbors had begun gathering along the roadside. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like Pine Ridge Estates. A couple stood near the edge of the gravel, watching quietly. Another man walked up behind Elaine with his phone already out recording. I could hear murmurs spreading through the small crowd. Is that the access road? I heard emergency vehicles can't get through. Yeah, the HOA's been talking about that. Elaine seemed to notice the growing audience. Her posture straightened, and suddenly her voice carried further. This isn't about personal property, she announced to the group. This is about public safety. If an ambulance or fire truck ever needed this route, that gate could cost someone their life. The crowd shifted uneasily. Now the narrative was changing. Instead of a dispute about property boundaries, it sounded like I was the guy selfishly blocking emergency services. I took a slow breath. Elaine, I said evenly, if this road is truly an emergency route, then there should be county documentation. She waved a dismissive hand. We've already handled the legal side. Then show it. She didn't. Instead, she nodded again toward the worker. The bolt cutters lifted. That's when I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stepped a few feet away and made a call. The man with the cutters paused again, watching me. Elaine narrowed her eyes. Who are you calling? She asked. I kept my eyes on the gate as the line began ringing. The county land use office. For the first time that morning, Elaine's expression shifted slightly. Just a flicker. The worker slowly lowered the bolt cutters again. Around us, the neighbors kept watching. No one spoke now. The call connected, and a calm voice answered on the other end. County Land Use Department. Hi, I said. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm calling about a possible unauthorized property entry and attempted gate removal at my address. Elaine crossed her arms. That's unnecessary, she said loudly, but I continued explaining the situation to the person on the phone. They're claiming HOA authority over a private access road. There are contractors here preparing to cut a gate. The county representative asked a few questions: location, property address, number of vehicles. I answered each one clearly. When I ended the call, the quiet around the gate felt heavier. The workers stood still. No one touched the chain. Elaine stared at me. You really think calling the county is going to stop this? She asked. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I don't think, I said calmly. I know. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger now, spreading along the roadside as people stepped outside their homes to see what was happening. And suddenly this wasn't just a small HOA project anymore. Now it was a public scene, and everyone was waiting to see who actually had the authority here. The trucks eventually left that morning, not because Elaine admitted she was wrong, and not because the workers suddenly decided to respect my gate. They left because the moment the word county entered the conversation, the contractors suddenly became a lot less interested in touching that chain. But the quiet didn't last long. 2 days later, the first letter arrived in my mailbox. It came in a plain white envelope with the Pine Ridge Estates HOA logo printed neatly across the corner. Inside was a formal notice titled Violation of Community Infrastructure Access. According to the document, I was illegally obstructing a designated HOA emergency route. I read the letter twice, then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the language was so confident. Whoever wrote it clearly assumed that repeating something often enough would make it true. The notice demanded that I remove my gate immediately and allow HOA access to the gravel road. If I refused, the letter explained the association reserved the right to begin issuing daily fines. The next letter arrived 3 days later. This one was more aggressive. The HOA claimed my gate violated community safety policies and could delay emergency responders. The language suggested that if I continued refusing access, the board would pursue legal remedies. That phrase appeared twice. Legal remedies. By the end of the week, another notice appeared on my property, this one taped directly to the outside of the gate itself. It warned that fines could begin accumulating at $200 per day. I pulled the paper down, folded it once, and slipped it into my truck. Elaine clearly believed pressure would force me to back down. Instead, all it did was confirm something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a strategy. Meanwhile, the conversation inside Pine Ridge Estates was growing louder. A neighbor I occasionally talked to at the gas station mentioned that the dispute had become a hot topic on the HOA's online forum. Apparently, several residents were discussing the emergency access problem. Some believed the HOA version completely. Others were asking questions. But the story spreading through the neighborhood was simple. According to the HOA, there was a road that emergency vehicles might need one day, and I was the stubborn landowner blocking it. That narrative traveled quickly. One afternoon, while I was repairing a fence line near the creek, a couple walking their dog stopped near the gate. "Are you Ethan?" the woman asked. I nodded. She looked uncomfortable. "We heard you won't open the road for emergency vehicles." I wiped the dust from my hands. "That road is private property," I said calmly. They exchanged uncertain looks before continuing their walk. That moment told me something important. Elaine wasn't just applying legal pressure. She was shaping the public story. If the community believed I was blocking emergency access, the HOA board could justify almost anything they tried next, which meant I needed to stop guessing and start verifying. That night I spread every document I had across the table in my workshop. Old property surveys, county parcel maps, land transfer records from when my grandfather first bought the ranch. The more I looked, the clearer the history became. The gravel road had always been inside our property boundary. There was no shared easement, no recorded right-of-way. Nothing in the county records gave Pine Ridge Estates any legal claim to it. Still, something about Elaine's confidence bothered me. People don't usually push this hard unless they believe they have something supporting them. So the next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk helped me pull the full property plat for the surrounding area, including the original development documents Pine Ridge Estates filed when the subdivision was built. That's where things finally made sense. One of the early developer diagrams showed a thin dotted line running through the back of my property. Next to it was a small label, Future Access Corridor. But when I compared that document to the official county plat map, the difference became obvious. The developer's diagram wasn't a legal easement. It was a concept sketch. The county records, the only documents that actually mattered, never approved or recorded that corridor as public access, which meant Elaine wasn't relying on real authority. She was relying on an old planning drawing that never became law. I sat there in the records office staring at the maps for a long moment, because suddenly the situation looked very different. Elaine wasn't just mistaken. She was trying to turn an abandoned developer idea into a real road. And if the HOA could open that gate and start using the road, eventually people would forget it was ever private property at all. That realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant something important. The dispute at my gate wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning. Once I understood what Elaine was relying on, the next step became obvious. Guessing and arguing wouldn't solve this. Documentation would. The first person I called was a property attorney in the county seat about 40 minutes away. His name was Mark Dalton, and he had spent most of his career dealing with land disputes, easements, and rural property rights. If anyone understood the difference between a real access corridor and a developer's wishful sketch, it would be him. I brought him everything I had: the HOA letters, photos from the morning when the truck showed up, copies of the county plat maps I had pulled from the records office. Mark spread the papers across his desk and studied them carefully. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he didn't look worried. "Based on this," he said, tapping the official county plat map with his pen, "that road sits entirely inside your parcel. So the HOA has no claim? Not unless there's a recorded easement somewhere we haven't seen." There wasn't. Still, Mark suggested we do one more thing. "Get a licensed surveyor out there," he said. "If this turns into a legal fight, having a current survey removes any argument about boundaries." 2 days later, a survey truck pulled onto my property. The surveyor, a quiet man named Luis, spent most of the morning walking the property lines with GPS equipment and bright orange boundary flags. By the afternoon, he had mapped the entire area, including the gravel road and the gate the HOA seemed so interested in. When he finished, he handed me a printed map. The lines were clear. The gravel road sat completely inside my property boundary, several feet away from the Pine Ridge Estates line. No overlap, no shared corridor, no easement. Luis pointed to the road on the map. "If someone told you this belonged to the HOA," he said, "they're wrong." That confirmation made the next step easier. I forwarded the survey to Mark and also sent a copy to the county land use office, the same department I had called the morning Elaine tried to cut the gate. A few days later, the county inspector returned my call. His name was Daniel Ruiz. He had already heard about the situation. Apparently, when a group of contractors shows up to open a private road inside a residential development, word tends to circulate quickly through county departments. I explained everything again. The attempted gate removal, the HOA violation notices, the claim that the road was emergency access. Ruiz asked me to email him the documents I had gathered, the survey, the developer diagram, the official county plat map. Later that afternoon, he called back. His tone had changed. "Mr. Carter," he said, "based on what I'm looking at, the HOA doesn't appear to have any recorded access rights to that road." That's what I thought. Also, he continued, if they attempt construction or modifications to that road without permits, it could be considered an unauthorized land development. Which meant something important. If Elaine tried to widen the road or force it open again, the county might treat it as a zoning violation. That changed the balance of the situation completely. Up until now, the HOA had been trying to pressure me through paperwork and public opinion. But if they crossed the line into actual construction, the county could step in. From that point forward, I started documenting everything. Every letter the HOA sent went into a growing folder on my desk. I printed copies of their violation notices and highlighted the sections claiming emergency access authority. I also attended 2 HOA meetings as a guest, sitting quietly in the back while Elaine discussed improving community infrastructure. During those meetings, I recorded the minutes where the board mentioned the gravel road and the possibility of opening it. Then there were the photographs. I saved every image from the morning the trucks appeared at my gate. The bolt cutters, the workers standing near the chain, Elaine pointing at the road like she already owned it. All of it went into the file. Because if this situation continued and based on Elaine's personality, it almost certainly would. I wanted every step documented. By the end of the week, the folder on my desk had turned into a thick stack of evidence, and the more I reviewed it, the more obvious something became. Elaine hadn't given up. The letters kept arriving. The language in them was growing stronger, which meant sooner or later the HOA was going to try something bigger than paperwork. And when that happened, I wanted everything ready. The survey, the county records, the legal documentation, all of it. Because the next time Pine Ridge Estates showed up at my gate, I had a feeling it wouldn't be with just 4 trucks. It would be with a plan. The monthly Pine Ridge Estates HOA meeting took place in the small community clubhouse just inside the subdivision entrance. Normally, I had no reason to attend. My property wasn't part of the HOA, and most of their discussions revolved around landscaping rules, mailbox colors, and parking complaints. But this meeting was different. I arrived early and sat quietly in the back row as residents slowly filled the folding chairs. Conversations buzzed around the room, neighbors catching up, a few people joking about lawn violations, others flipping through printed meeting agendas. At the front of the room stood Elaine Whitmore. She looked completely comfortable behind the long table where the HOA board usually sat. A projector screen had been pulled down behind her, and a laptop sat open in front of her like she was about to deliver a presentation. That alone told me something. This wasn't just a casual discussion. This was a plan. Once the room settled, Elaine tapped the microphone. "Thank you everyone for coming tonight," she began. "We have several community improvement topics to discuss, but I'd like to start with a major infrastructure opportunity." The screen behind her lit up. A map appeared. I recognized it immediately. It was the same developer diagram I had found in the county records office, the one showing the dotted line labeled Future Access Corridor. Elaine pointed to the image with a laser pointer. "As many of you know," she said, "Pine Ridge Estates currently has limited emergency vehicle access on the western side of the neighborhood." Several residents nodded. "For years," she continued, "there has been an unused gravel road directly behind our community that connects to the county highway." The red dot on the screen traced the exact route of the road that ran through my property. Elaine paused for effect. "Our board has been reviewing ways to improve safety and accessibility for all residents." She clicked the remote again. The next slide showed a concept drawing. The gravel road had been transformed into a wide paved lane, with sidewalks and drainage lines drawn neatly along the edges. "This project," Elaine explained, "would allow us to widen the road, pave it, and officially convert it into an HOA emergency access route. A murmur moved through the room. Some people leaned forward in their chairs. Others exchanged curious looks. Elaine smiled, clearly pleased with the attention. The benefits are obvious, she continued. Emergency vehicles would have a secondary route into the neighborhood. Property values would increase with improved infrastructure, and it would provide a safer evacuation route if necessary. One man near the front raised his hand. "Where exactly is that road?" he asked. Elaine pointed at the screen again. "It runs just beyond the western fence line. Many of you have probably seen the gate blocking it." A few people nodded. Another resident spoke up. "I thought that belonged to the ranch property back there." Elaine gave a reassuring smile. "There's been some confusion about that over the years," she said, "but our legal team has reviewed the situation." That line hung in the air for a moment. "Our attorneys believe the road qualifies as a community access corridor," she continued competently, "which means the HOA has the right to open it." A few residents began murmuring approval. One woman near the aisle said, "That would definitely help emergency vehicles." Another man added, "Honestly, I always wondered why that gate was there." From the back row, I finally stood. Every head in the room turned toward me. Elaine's smile faded slightly. "Good evening," I said calmly. Several people recognized me immediately. "Oh," someone whispered. "That's the guy who owns the ranch." I walked a few steps closer to the front of the room. "Since the road you're discussing runs through my property," I said, "I think I should ask a question." Elaine folded her hands on the table. "Go ahead. Can you show the county easement for that road?" The room went quiet. Elaine blinked once, then recovered quickly. "Our legal team has already reviewed the documents," she said. "That wasn't my question," I replied. A few residents shifted in their seats. "What I asked," I continued, "was whether there is a recorded county easement allowing the HOA to use that road." Elaine's voice sharpened slightly. "The HOA board has determined the road qualifies as emergency access infrastructure. That still doesn't answer the question." A man in the front row leaned toward Elaine. "Do we have the easement paperwork?" Elaine ignored him. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter," she said, "this meeting is about community planning, not debating legal technicalities." "It's not a technicality," I replied. "It's the entire issue." The projector screen still showed the dotted line running straight through my land. I turned toward the residents. "The road you're looking at sits entirely inside my property boundary," I said. "There's no easement recorded with the county." A ripple of uncertainty moved through the room. Elaine stepped forward again. "Our legal counsel disagrees," she said firmly. "Then show the document." She didn't. Instead, she clicked the remote again. The next slide appeared, a timeline. At the bottom of the screen were the words Phase 1 construction, scheduled next week. The room reacted instantly. "You're starting construction already? That soon?" Elaine nodded confidently. "The board believes this project is in the best interest of the community," she said. "We've already begun arranging contractors to open the road and begin widening it." I felt several eyes turning toward me. "Without a county permit?" I asked. Elaine's patience was clearly fading. "The HOA has the authority to improve community infrastructure, not on private land." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Carter, you've had years to cooperate with the HOA on this matter. That's because it's not an HOA road." Some residents were whispering now. A woman near the back asked, "Wait, are we sure the HOA owns that road?" Elaine raised her voice just enough to regain control of the room. "This project has been thoroughly reviewed," she said, "and it will move forward." She looked directly at me. "If you have concerns, you're welcome to discuss them with our legal team later." That was her way of ending the conversation. The board members beside her nodded in agreement. Several residents seemed uncertain, but no one spoke up again. The meeting continued with other agenda items, but the atmosphere had changed. Every so often, someone glanced toward me in the back row. When the meeting finally ended, people filed out of the room slowly, still talking about the road project. Elaine packed up her laptop without looking in my direction. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, one thing was clear. The HOA wasn't just talking anymore. They were planning to start construction. And according to Elaine's presentation, It was happening next week. The following week started quietly. Too quietly. For 2 days, nothing happened. No letters from the HOA, no trucks near the gate, no updates from the Pine Ridge Estates forum that one of my neighbors had occasionally been showing me. But early Thursday morning, the quiet ended. I heard the engines before I saw the vehicles. Heavy diesel engines. I stepped outside and looked down the gravel road toward the gate. This time it wasn't 4 trucks, it was more. 2 HOA utility trucks, a flatbed carrying construction materials, and behind them, a small excavator rolling slowly toward the gate. Dust rolled across the field as the vehicles stopped outside the chain. Workers climbed out quickly, moving with the efficiency of people who had already been given instructions. Toolboxes came out first. Then the excavator operator climbed down from the cab and walked toward the gate. Behind them, Elaine Whitmore stepped out of the lead truck. She was dressed differently today. Hard hat, reflective vest, clipboard tucked under her arm. It looked less like an HOA visit and more like a construction project. I walked down the porch steps and headed toward the gate. Elaine saw me immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said with a thin smile. I stopped a few feet away. "You're starting construction?" "We're opening a community access road," she corrected. 2 workers were already pulling tools from the truck bed. One of them picked up a metal cutting saw. Another began examining the hinges on the gate. "You don't have permission to touch that gate," I said. Elaine didn't even glance at them. "Our legal department has already addressed that." Behind her, the excavator engine rumbled louder as the operator prepared to move closer. Several Pine Ridge residents had gathered again along the roadside. Some were watching curiously. Others seemed excited, like they were witnessing the start of a neighborhood improvement project. Elaine turned toward the workers. "Remove the gate," she said. The man with the saw stepped forward. The sound of the engine roared to life. I pulled my phone from my pocket. Elaine noticed immediately. "You've already called the county once," she said. "They never stopped the project." "I know," I replied, because this time I had called them earlier that morning, right after I heard the trucks coming down the road. The saw blade spun against the metal hinge with a high grinding scream. Sparks flew against the gravel. The first hinge snapped free. The gate sagged slightly. Then another sound echoed down the road. Sirens. Not emergency sirens. Short warning bursts. Everyone turned. 2 white county enforcement vehicles rolled toward the gate, lights flashing but sirens silent now. They stopped directly behind the construction trucks. The workers froze. Elaine's confident expression faltered for the first time that morning. 3 county officials stepped out. One of them was the same land use inspector I had spoken with before, Daniel Ruiz. He walked straight toward the equipment. "What's going on here?" he asked. Elaine stepped forward quickly. "This is an HOA infrastructure project," she said. "We're opening a community access road." Ruiz looked past her toward the gate, where the half-cut hinge hung loose. "Do you have a county development permit for this work?" he asked. Elaine hesitated. "Our legal team confirmed we have authority. That's not what I asked." Ruiz turned toward the excavator. "Shut that machine off." The operator didn't argue. The engine died instantly. Ruiz pulled a tablet from his bag and began reviewing documents. "What parcel are we on right now?" he asked. Elaine pointed toward the road. "This corridor connects Pine Ridge Estates to the county highway." Ruiz nodded slowly. Then he looked up. "According to county records," he said, "this road sits inside parcel 14B. He glanced at me. "That parcel belongs to Ethan Carter." A murmur spread through the group of residents. Elaine shook her head. "That's not correct." Ruiz turned the tablet around so she could see the map. The screen showed the official county plat map. The boundary line ran clearly along the edge of the Pine Ridge Estates development. The gravel road sat entirely inside my property. "No easement recorded," Ruiz said. "No shared access agreement." Elaine crossed her arms. "The HOA attorneys reviewed this." Ruiz's voice stayed calm. "Do you have a construction permit issued by the county?" She didn't answer. "Do you have a recorded easement?" Still nothing. Ruiz looked toward the other county officers. Then he turned back toward the workers. "Everyone step away from the equipment." The workers moved back immediately. Ruiz pulled a document from his bag. "This project is now under a stop work order," he announced. the words carried across the road. No further activity will take place on this site until the county completes its review. Elaine stepped forward again. You can't shut down a community safety project. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. I can when it involves unauthorized land development on private property. Another county officer began writing notes. Additionally, Ruiz continued, removal of that gate constitutes potential trespassing and property damage. The workers avoided eye contact. Some of the residents began whispering among themselves. Elaine's voice grew sharper. This road was always intended for community access. Ruiz tapped the tablet screen again. Intent doesn't override recorded land ownership. He turned to the other officer. Document the equipment and contractor vehicles. The officer began taking photos. Another handed Elaine a printed notice. This is a formal citation, Ruiz said. The HOA will need to appear before the county planning office regarding unauthorized development activity. Elaine stared at the paper. You're making a mistake. Ruiz shook his head. No, he said calmly. You made one when you brought construction equipment onto someone else's land. The excavator sat silent beside the half-cut gate hinge. The workers looked uncertain, waiting for instructions that were no longer coming. And the group of Pine Ridge residents who had gathered to watch the project begin now stood there watching it collapse instead. The county truck stayed parked at the gate for nearly an hour after the stop work order was issued. During that time, the entire scene slowly shifted from construction project to enforcement zone. Daniel Ruiz and the other county officers moved methodically between the vehicles, documenting everything. They photographed the excavator, the tool trucks, and the partially cut hinge on my gate. They even took close-up photos of the saw blade lying on the gravel beside the fence post. Meanwhile, the contractors stood in a loose group near their trucks, clearly waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. But that someone wasn't Elaine anymore. Ruiz finished reviewing his tablet and turned toward the workers. All equipment needs to be removed from this property immediately, he said. One of the contractors raised a hand cautiously. Do we need to load everything up right now? Yes, Ruiz replied. This site is under an active stop work order. No construction equipment is permitted to remain here. The man nodded and immediately began directing the others. Within minutes, the workers were reversing the process they had started earlier that morning. Tools went back into truck beds. The cutting saw was packed away. The excavator operator climbed into the cab and carefully maneuvered the machine away from the gate. The same neighbors who had gathered to watch the road project now watched something very different. They were watching the HOA being shut down. Elaine stood beside her truck, still holding the citation paper Ruiz had handed her. Her confident posture from earlier that morning had vanished. This isn't over, she said quietly as Ruiz approached again. He didn't sound interested in arguing. It will be handled through the county planning office, he replied. For now, the project is terminated. Ruiz then turned toward me. Mr. Carter, he said, the county will require the HOA to restore any damage caused during this attempt. He pointed toward the gate. The hinge that was cut will need to be repaired. If additional damage is discovered, it should be documented and submitted to the county. I nodded. Understood. Elaine shook her head in frustration. This road is critical for emergency access, she insisted again. Ruiz gestured toward the map still open on his tablet. The emergency access argument doesn't override property ownership. If the HOA believes an easement is necessary, they'll need to pursue it legally through the courts. That was the first time anyone had said the word courts out loud. And judging by the way Elaine's expression tightened, she knew exactly what that meant. The trucks began leaving one by one. First the flatbed, then the excavator. Finally, the two HOA utility trucks. Within 20 minutes, the road was quiet again, except for the county vehicles finishing their documentation. As Ruiz walked back toward his truck, he paused beside me. You handled this the right way, he said. If they attempt anything like this again, contact the county immediately. I will. He nodded once and climbed into the vehicle. Soon the flashing lights disappeared down the road. And for the first time since the dispute began, the gate stood alone again. The legal consequences began unfolding almost immediately. 3 days after the construction attempt, Pine Ridge Estates received formal notices from the county planning department. The citations listed multiple violations: unauthorized land development, construction activity without permits, trespassing onto private property. Each violation carried financial penalties. When the final numbers were calculated, the HOA was facing tens of thousands of dollars in fines. Word spread through the neighborhood quickly. Residents who had once supported the road project suddenly began asking questions. Several homeowners contacted the HOA board demanding explanations. Why had construction been started without county approval? Why hadn't the board confirmed the property boundary first? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, who would be responsible for paying the fines? While that chaos unfolded inside Pine Ridge Estates, I took the next step Mark Dalton had recommended. I filed a civil claim for property damage. The documentation was simple: photographs of the cut hinge, records of the attempted gate removal, copies of the county enforcement report. Within a week, the HOA's legal representatives contacted my attorney. The tone of their message was very different from Elaine's earlier confidence. They wanted to discuss settlement options. Negotiations took place quietly over the next several weeks. The HOA agreed to pay for full repair of the gate and fencing. They also agreed to cover legal expenses related to the incident. But the most important part of the agreement wasn't financial. It was written into the final settlement document, a formal acknowledgement that the gravel road belonged entirely to Ethan Carter's private property, with no HOA easement or access rights. The document was signed by the HOA board and filed with the county. That single piece of paper ended the argument permanently. The public outcome inside Pine Ridge Estates was impossible to ignore. Residents had watched the construction attempt. They had seen the county officers arrive. And now they were hearing about the fines and legal settlement. The narrative Elaine had tried to build that the road was an emergency route, unfairly blocked by a stubborn landowner, was falling apart. Because the truth had become very simple. The HOA had tried to take control of land that didn't belong to them, and the county had stopped it. A few weeks after the settlement was finalized, I received an unexpected knock at my gate. 2 Pine Ridge residents were standing there. They looked uncomfortable. "We wanted to apologize," one of them said. "For what?" "We believe the HOA version of the story." I leaned against the fence. "That happens." The man nodded. "Turns out the road was yours the whole time." "Yes," I said calmly. "It always was." They thanked me for the conversation and headed back toward the neighborhood. I watched them walk down the road for a moment before turning back toward the house. The gate stood exactly where it had always been. The gravel road stretched beyond it toward the fields my grandfather once worked. And for the first time since the trucks had arrived that morning, the fight over it was finally over. The weeks following the county shutdown felt strangely quiet. For months, the dispute with the HOA had been a constant presence: letters, meetings, rumors, trucks showing up at the gate. Then suddenly the noise disappeared. But inside Pine Ridge Estates, things were anything but quiet. Word of the county fine spread through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement could control. Residents began discussing the situation on the HOA forum, in the clubhouse parking lot, and during evening walks along the subdivision sidewalks. At first, the conversations were cautious. People asked simple questions. How much were the fines? Why had construction started without permits? Did the HOA really try to open a road that wasn't theirs? Then the tone began to change. Homeowners who had originally supported the project started digging into the meeting minutes and board decisions. Some discovered that the construction vote had been rushed through quickly, with little documentation presented to the rest of the board. And one detail kept appearing again and again. The decision to move forward had been pushed hardest by Elaine Whitmore. Within a few days, the HOA board scheduled a special meeting to address the situation. This time the room was much more tense than the presentation meeting a few weeks earlier. Residents filled nearly every chair. Some stood along the walls. Several people had printed copies of the county citations in their hands. When Elaine walked into the room, the usual confident posture she carried was gone. The board opened the meeting with a brief statement acknowledging the county's enforcement action and the ongoing settlement negotiations. Then the questions began. One homeowner stood up immediately. Why didn't the board confirm the property boundary before approving construction? Another resident asked. Who authorized the contractors? Someone else raised the issue of the fines. Are HOA members responsible for paying those penalties? The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Elaine attempted to answer some of the questions, but her explanation sounded very different from the confident presentation she had delivered weeks earlier. She insisted the board had acted in the interest of community safety. She claimed the developer diagrams had suggested the road could become a future access route. But every time she spoke, someone else pointed back to the county records. The room grew louder. Finally, one of the other board members leaned toward the microphone. "We're currently reviewing how this decision was made," he said carefully. "An internal investigation is underway." That was the moment the situation truly shifted. Because when a board starts using the word investigation, it usually means someone's leadership is about to end. 2 days later, Pine Ridge Estates released a short announcement to residents. Elaine Whitmore had resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. The notice described the resignation as a personal decision related to the recent dispute, but everyone in the neighborhood understood the real reason. Her authority had collapsed the moment the county officers issued the stop work order. And once the fines and settlement became public knowledge, the board had little choice but to distance themselves from the decision. The investigation into the board's actions continued for several weeks. During that time, another problem surfaced. The HOA's insurance provider reviewed the situation. Their conclusion wasn't good news for Pine Ridge Estates. Because the construction had been initiated without county permits and outside HOA jurisdiction, the insurance company determined the incident fell under unauthorized activity, which meant the insurance policy would not cover the fines or legal expenses. Suddenly, the financial consequences of the project were very real. The HOA would have to pay the penalties and settlement costs directly from its operating funds. Residents who had once supported the road project now had a much stronger opinion about it. Meanwhile, life on my side of the fence slowly returned to normal. The gate still needed repairs where the hinge had been cut during the construction attempt. I spent a Saturday morning replacing the damaged hardware and reinforcing the post with a thicker steel bracket. By the afternoon, the gate swung smoothly again. I also added fresh gravel to the first stretch of road, filling in the ruts left by the excavator tracks. Standing there with a shovel in my hands, I couldn't help thinking about my grandfather. He had built that road with nothing more than a tractor and a lot of patience. And decades later, the same stretch of gravel had almost turned into a neighborhood street. But in the end, it was still what it had always been: a private ranch road. Over the next few weeks, a few Pine Ridge residents stopped by the gate occasionally. Most of them came with the same reason: they wanted to apologize. One older couple told me they had voted in favor of the road project at the HOA meeting. "We believed what the board told us," the man admitted. Another resident said she had repeated the emergency access rumor to several neighbors before learning the truth. "I'm sorry about that," she said. I shrugged. Rumors travel fast. The important thing was that the tension between the property and the neighborhood had started to fade. Without Elaine pushing the issue, the HOA stopped sending letters. The violation notices disappeared. The gate remained closed, and the road remained exactly where it had always been, inside the Carter family property. By the end of the season, Pine Ridge Estates had elected a new HOA president. From what I heard, the new board leadership had adopted a much more cautious approach to community projects, especially projects that involved land outside the subdivision. And honestly, that was probably the best outcome anyone could have asked for. Because after everything that had happened, no one in Pine Ridge Estates seemed interested in testing that gate again. A few weeks after everything settled down, the road looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet. Unpaved. Running straight through the same stretch of land my grandfather once worked with his own hands. One evening I stood near the gate, watching the sun drop behind the fields. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked a few steps down the road, the same road I had spent half my childhood helping maintain. For a while, the whole fight with the HOA had felt bigger than it really was. Letters, meetings, construction trucks, county inspectors. But standing there in the fading light, the situation felt surprisingly simple. This had never really been about a road. It was about understanding what belongs to you and being willing to protect it. Property rights can sound like a technical thing: documents, surveys, legal language, but when you grow up on land like this, those lines on a map represent something much deeper. They represent history, work, family. The gravel road stretching out in front of me had been part of that history long before Pine Ridge Estates ever appeared next door. And now, thanks to a few maps, a good survey, and the county doing its job, that history was still intact. Inside the neighborhood, things had changed too. The new HOA leadership had clearly learned a lesson from the situation. Projects now moved slower. Decisions involved more research. and anything related to property boundaries was treated with a lot more caution. Honestly, that was probably the best outcome for everyone, because most communities don't need more rules or louder arguments. They just need people willing to check the facts before trying to move someone else's fence. As the evening wind moved through the grass, I closed the gate and walked back toward the house. The road remained exactly where it had always been, right where my grandfather built it, and now, officially and permanently, right where it belonged.